Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the Staten Island Museum today for Lunch and Learn. Lunch and Learn is a program series connected to objects in the museum's collection across natural science, art, and history. All of these objects so far in our Lunch and Learn series are in our anniversary exhibition, 140 Objects. The Staten Island Museum turned 140 this year, so happy birthday, Staten Island Museum. And so we're here to learn about Eastern bluebirds and European starlings with Danielle Belleny. Danielle Belleny is a Texas-raised wildlife biologist, cemetery birder, and science communicator based in San Marcos, Texas. Danielle is a member of the BlackAFinSTEM Collective and a co-organizer of Black Birders Week. So welcome, Danielle.
So excited to be here. We have a lot to discuss. I'm very excited to talk about these two birds. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Just waiting for the slides to pop up right now.
I am sharing my screen.
Yes, I can see them now.
Okay.
So let's talk about the relationship between these two species. They have a sort of heated relationship, but I will refrain from putting either of these species in bad light because this relationship was caused by humans, not a surprise. And we'll get into that, don't worry. These two also share some really, really cool similarities that I'll highlight. And personally, I believe they're both really interesting, and I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to experience both of these species still today. So based on the facts that I provide you, I will want you to decide at the end of this presentation which team you're on, Team Bluebird or Team Starling. And this is essentially like if you had the chance to become one of these two species, which one would you choose? So let's get into it. Let's get ready to rumble. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the blue corner, representing North America, is a small thrush that is related to robins, standing at around 7 to 8 inches and weighing around 28 to 31 grams. I present the Eastern bluebird. And in the red corner, representing Europe and Eurasia, and they are kind of related to Mimidi, which is a family of passerines that are really, really good sound mimics. So mockingbirds fall under that family of Mimidi. Standing around 8.5 inches and weighing around 80-ish grams, I present the European starling. All right, let's go to the next slide. So first, we're going to dive into the Eastern bluebird. Their scientific name is Scialia scialis, and I really like diving into like why their scientific names are that, because usually there's like hidden meanings inside of that scientific name. So Scialia scialis translates from Latin to wonderful little bird, and they truly are a wonderful little bird. They're very, very cute. Obviously, they're named because of their gorgeous blue feathers and where they're found, mostly in the eastern United States, but they also have a range that extends down to Nicaragua, that's in Central America. In the United States, bluebirds are usually found from the East Coast to the Great Plains. So around Colorado is about as far west as we're going to find them in the United States. But most of their northern range is seasonal. They'll stay there in the warmer months and for the breeding season, and then they'll head south for the winter. So bluebirds that are south of around West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, they're usually year-round residents because it's warm enough for them to stay there and get all the food supplies that they need for the entire year. With the exception of like Western Texas and like the western edge of their range, they will probably just spend a winter there and migrate like the other birds. Now let's get into feathers, because feathers are extremely important for birds. They're super specialized. What they do is help birds regulate their body temperature. They help them find mates, they help them fly and camouflage. Feathers are made from keratin, just like our hair is in nail. So when you look at a bird, you may seem to notice that they look like they're covered like head to toe, 99% of the bird is covered in feathers. However, feathers are actually neatly arranged in these tracts that only occur in certain areas of the bird. And those feathers are just so fluffy and plumacious and full that they are able to cover the entire bird. So again, they are only in like little rows, but still able to encompass the entire bird. So just like the hairs that grow from a mammal's skin, feathers grow from organized masses of dead proteins that are slowly pushed out of your living skin. That's basically how our hair is formed, how our nails are formed, and how feathers are formed. This doesn't sound very pretty, but the end result is gorgeous. Despite the typical molting patterns of other birds, so typically birds are going to molt in the springtime. They get a cool, nice new set of feathers right before they're trying to attract a mate. However, bluebirds usually do that later in the winter. They don't molt their feathers the typical times in like spring. And I'll get into that a little bit more because they kind of have these like time release feathers. And so what happens is when they do actually molt those feathers, at first they start out really bright blue, but they also have the tips of those feathers are covered in an orangish kind of feather as well. And over time, that orange part wears away and it leaves just the blue feather when the springtime happens. So when they molt initially in the winter, they'll have like blue and a little bit of orange. And then by the time it gets to spring, they're nice and bright blue completely. And the interesting thing about the color blue, especially in bird feathers and a lot of insects too, also, they use optical illusion to create the blue color. So you're not actually seeing blue in their feathers. Their feathers are traditionally like a grayish brown color, but because there are tiny little structures that line up certain ways with the visible light spectrum, they are able to just reflect blue light in sunlight. So if you find a blue feather on the ground, either from like a bluebird or a blue jay, if you hold it up in the light, it'll look blue, but if you put it in the shade, in the darkness, it'll be grayish brown. Again, because there's no light bouncing off of those specialized keratin structures that create the that blue color. So the differences between the plumages between the male and female eastern bluebirds help them be easily distinguished. So males have that really bright blue color from like their head down to their back and a really brightly colored orange chest. Whereas the females, they have the blue color, it's a little bit more muted, and so are their orange bellies and chests. They're not as brightly colored as the males are. But this helps bystanders and observers who want to monitor their nests to be able to easily differentiate between the male and the female bluebird. So we have a lot of studies and a lot of information about nest duties and nest roles between the two birds. Let's go to the next slide. So as far as places where we can find bluebirds, they are mainly before Europeans arrived, bluebirds' ancestral habitats were likely created by fire-maintained savannas that were in open stands of mature pines or forest. They would nest in tree snags, which were, old dead trees that have broken limbs and have cavities inside of them. And then we started cutting down trees and forests and stuff, which did take away habitats from from eastern bluebirds. But at the same time, it kind of unintentionally created habitats because these birds like to also be in open areas. I'm not sure if anyone has experienced an eastern bluebird, but they mostly occur in like farmlands or parks. I see them a lot in cemeteries or golf courses. Those types of areas attract bluebirds. But historically, they would also go around forest areas that had clearings inside of them as well. So again, as Europeans arrived and as they expanded their colonies, initially it was creating habitats, but too much removing of the forest eventually took away habitat from those birds. So that was an impact that kind of negatively affected bluebirds and a lot of other wildlife populations too, in those early 20th centuries. So the change in land use initially led to an increase, but then it led to a decrease of space. And initially, bluebirds are secondary nest cavity. They are secondary cavity nesters. And this means that they rely on some other animal to create the nest cavity for them. This would mean that they would need a woodpecker or some type of animal to clear out a hole or have the tree die in order for it to be dug out for them to create a new nest. Their beaks are not strong enough for them to be able to dig out their own nest, and they're able to find shelter and able to find safety in those tree cavities and those old tree limbs. So as the forests were being taken away, they're obviously losing those critical nesting locations, which would also lead to some population declines as people were expanding in the eastern side of the United States. The diet of eastern bluebirds is typically insects. So that's why you'll find them in a lot of open areas. They're just looking through the grass, looking for grasshoppers or crickets or beetles. And they'll opportunistically eat like a small lizard or a small snake. And in the winter, they'll transition over to berries because there's not nearly as many insects to eat as well. You'll find them sitting and waiting on perches like the one that's in this photograph. That's an example of a bluebird waiting to swoop down and find a bug to eat. So some more of their population declines were also impacted by the introduction of species. Europeans brought over some animals that they wanted to, remind them of their previous homes. That included things like European starlings and house sparrows, which also caused some of the demises of bluebirds. But I'll talk more about that when I get into the specifics about European starlings, but that did contribute to some of their population declines through the 1920s and the 1970s. As I mentioned, bluebirds are cavity nesters. So as their habitats were being removed, some people took notice and were like, well, hey, if we're going to remove habitats, let's, try to build a habitat for eastern bluebirds. So some initiatives for population recovery initially started out by just building bluebird boxes. It's a pretty simple box and it has a hole inside of it that allows bluebirds to come in and out. And they are really, really helpful for bluebirds that no longer have these natural nest cavities. And it seems like they actually kind of prefer nesting inside of the bluebird boxes. You don't typically see a bluebird nesting in a natural tree cavity as much today as they did historically. Let's go to the next slide, and it's a video of a eastern bluebird in a natural tree cavity. So it does still happen today. It's not unheard of, but they definitely do like and do really well in the human created cavities. So this is the male bluebird, and you can tell by that really bright blue color on his back and on his chest, the really bright orange color on his chest as well. It seems like he's checking out the cavity or helping the female tend to the nestlings. And it looks like this individual is the female. She's a lot more drab than the male is. So in the 1970s, the North American Bluebird Society was formed. It was a citizen science program that was really concerned about the drastic declines of bluebirds and their populations. So these types, bluebird nest boxes, which I'll show you an example shortly, were created and set up in these trails and also in golf courses all over the United States. And they were able to really improve the drastic population declines that that Eastern bluebirds were exhibiting. We lost around like 90% of the species, in some areas they had declines of around 90% of the bluebird population. But now because of these efforts, we see a positive trend in their population numbers. So really great citizen science efforts done by people who cared about birds. So let's go on to European starling biology. So similarly to the Eastern bluebirds, European starlings are also named because of their origins and how they look. They are native to Europe and Eurasia, and there are a couple hundred different species of starlings. So this is not the only starling species that exist. And a lot of them are just absolutely gorgeous. I personally think starlings that we have are also really pretty. They're really iridescent and have some really interesting spots going on. But I do implore you to look up some of the European, African, and Asian starling species that do exist. They have some really incredible colors. So let's break down their scientific name. Sturnus means little star, which references their star-like shape and silhouette in flight. They have a really long, really pointy beak. When outstretched, their wings are shaped like triangles, and their tail is kind of triangular too. So if you combine those parts, they kind of look like a star. And they're also really shiny. I think that could help make them look star-like. So one of their really good ID tips, one of the ways that I can just like look at a starling for half a second and know immediately that is a starling is by that star-like shape. They look like flying Doritos, honestly, like very triangular, very pointy, and it's like, it can't be anything else. It has to be a starling. So if you see one like that, then I hope you're able to use that ID tip as well. You've probably encountered a starling. They are in most areas where people occupy, and they are pretty much everywhere. They were brought here in 1890. Well, they were brought here a couple of times before 1890, but those introductions were not successful. But in 1890 and 1891, about 100 individuals were released in Central Park by a poet, a Shakespeare enthusiast named Eugene Shefflin. He wanted to bring all of Shakespeare's birds that were mentioned in his plays to North America. And the starling was one of those birds that successfully infiltrated or successfully colonized North America. So introduced in 1890, and by 1940, they were through most of the United States, and by 1970, they had made it to Alaska. So super fast, only 100 birds to start out with. Now we have around 200 million European starlings living in North America. But they're also in Europe still naturally, and surprisingly, the European populations are experiencing declines because they are having a loss of their natural habitats. So yeah, now we have around 200 million of these individuals. You'll probably see them in big flocks throughout the year, in feeding in lawns, feeding in garbage, feeding, in cities and parks and farms. They again like open habitats, similarly to Eastern bluebirds. They also have time-release feathers, again, like the bluebird did, and how bluebirds started out with orange tips on their feathers, and then as they wore away, they were more blue. That happens with European starlings, but for the spots that are on their feathers, they only have these spots during certain times of the year. I believe it's in the winter time. And then as time goes on, the abrasion of flying and going through things rubs off those spots, and then they are just black with the iridescence and other things. It's very, very interesting to see. So they do change, I guess, they don't really change their feathers. They just lose pieces of their feathers to change their look for breeding season. They are also sexually dimorphic. Males and females have different colored beaks. So take a closer look at European starlings next time. Males have little bluish bases on their beaks and females have reddish pink specks on their beak. And again, that iridescence is another structural color. So, you know how I talked about blue as an optical illusion, the iridescence on European starlings has that similar play with your eyes in the light type of trick. Now you see it, now you don't in certain types of lighting. Let's go to the next slide. So here is an example of a Bluebird box. And this Bluebird box, unfortunately, had some starlings and a house sparrow checking it out. So similar to bluebirds, starlings also forage in open areas. They have really strong beaks that allow them to poke into the ground and stretch open their mouths and pick out insects, even after the ground has had a first frost. So super, super strong beaks, super strong mouths. They are also really good mimics. It is famously known that Mozart owned a starling because he was so inspired by the music the bird was able to make. So the bird would learn Mozart songs, but then slightly alter it because it's a bird brain. You know, it can't get everything perfect, but they were really good mimics at doing mostly what Mozart was playing. And then Mozart would be like, oh, I kind of like how that bird made that rendition. I'm a try to copy what the bird did. And unfortunately, when the bird died, Mozart, it was a very beloved bird. So he arranged a very fancy funeral procession and made an elaborate headstone and eloquent poem for his beloved starling. Are we having trouble with that video? Okay, that's all right. But that is an example of a Bluebird box. People just built those and bluebirds took to it and they did great. Unfortunately, European starlings are also cavity nesters. They are able to push out bluebirds and other cavity nesting birds from those types of areas. And they will kill the young that are, they will kill the young, sorry. I think they're doing maintenance next door. European starlings and house sparrows are actually kind of nest bullies. They are able to kill adults and also take over a nest. And house sparrows are even known to build nest on top of the dead bodies of the parents and the babies that they take over, which is really unfortunate and kind of brutal, but that's why they're able to do so well. They're cutthroat. And in the winter, European starlings, they form these really beautiful displays that are called murmurations. They are starting from the communal roost site around the sunset, especially, you'll see these birds moving in these fancy swirling patterns that are just absolutely beautiful to behold. And if you ever have a chance, or if you ever see them like on the side of the road, definitely pull over and see what they're doing. You can't really miss it. It's like a bunch of birds all in a ball swirling around. And I actually have a video of it to show y'all. So if you aren't able to experience it yourself, here's an example of what it should look like. So the way these birds are able to follow each other in these really complex patterns is they're paying really, really close attention to the birds that are most closest to them. So there's about 7 birds around the radius of each bird. And they're just paying attention to their neighbors and following the directions that they're moving and following. And eventually that creates like a ripple effect, and it creates these really interesting shapes and really abstract movements. It's absolutely beautiful to be able to see in person. Okay, next slide, please. So that is pretty much how I would like to present European starlings and Eastern bluebirds. Sure, they have some difficulties with each other. Starlings taking over their nest definitely affected their populations, but starlings are also just so cool. And European bluebirds, another gorgeous bird, another really awesome bird. But if you had a choice to be one of the two, which one would you choose? And I'll also open up to any questions that y'all have.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I also wanted to point out that we had a special guest in the house, which is an actual European starling named Sherwin, who you might be able to see in the background of Heather Charmello's video. I just wanted to point that out. But Donald, you had a question?
I did have a question. Thank you so much, Danielle. I was just curious about these optics in the feathers. Is it assumed that the birds are seeing similar colors and similar, blues or iridescences that we see, or it's transposed somehow, or what do we know of that?
Yeah, so it's absolutely different in bird vision because they have UV vision. So under UV light, iridescence looks completely different. Blue color looks completely different. So birds are seeing a different world than what we're able to. So we have I don't know if we have a cooler vision or not, but I think iridescence is probably something that's really gorgeous to observe. I hope birds can see it too.
Great question. I also saw in the chat earlier that Catherine had seen bluebirds at Mount Loretto this Sunday. So that's great news.
Oh, congrats. And there's a couple other species of bluebirds too. There's Western bluebirds, and I'm forgetting another species, but there's a couple of species that occur in North America, not just the Eastern bluebirds, mountain bluebirds. That's the one I was forgetting. Very pretty, gorgeous blues.
I would jump in with one more question, if you don't mind, and that's about the murmurations, which are incredible. I have been able to see them, but do we have any idea what's going on there? Is there any functional rationale to what's going on?
I don't think so. I just think it's maybe an activity that they do before roosting together. I'm not entirely sure why they do it though. Is anyone familiar with great-tailed grackles or any type of grackles? Like usually around this time of year too, they're grouping up in these really large communal groups, especially like next to the Red Lobster and the Walmart and stuff. They hang out in these big groups too, and I think for safety. Now they're not doing murmurations, but I think maybe it's team bonding. They're able to help protect each other and keeping their eyes sharp. That's kind of how I would envision.
Also, we have a heated debate in the chat between Team Bluebird and Team European Starling. Just want to call attention to that. We have a question from Henrik. Is it likely to see a bluebird in Manhattan, perhaps Inward Hill Park?
I am not from New York, so I would say, I recommend you go to ebird.org. That is a place where you can just go see what birds have been observed around you. So it's typing it into the chat right now. ebird.org. A lot of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology websites have great resources for either building bluebird boxes or bird conservation in general, but also identification of birds. You can find plenty of information about those things, apps and online.
Thank you. And Danielle, can you let everyone know how they can follow your work?
Yeah, sure. I am best found online on Instagram, but you can also find me on Twitter at @BellsIsBirding. If you want to contact me further, I recommend just sending me a DM through there and we can talk some more. Oh, I think I just saw our little friend Starling fly.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions in the house before we end this session? All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you for teaching us all about European starlings and bluebirds. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day. Enjoy.
Thank you.